Hi, I'm Bill Griffith, and this is For Art's Sake. The exhibition 2017 State of the Art Biennial, and we came up with a theme called Inspiration and Admiration. So the theme for this exhibition, I invited 8 artists whose work I know well and whose artists who I know personally, either collegially or personally or professionally. And I selected 8 artists whose work I admire and in some cases inspired by, and then in turn I asked each of those 8 artists to invite an artist who has had an impact on their work or the way their studio life or just their way of working. So there's a total of 16 artists in this exhibition. So I wanted to start just by talking about a few of the artists that I invited, and then I can talk to you also about who they invited and maybe some reasons why. So we'll start with Peter, and this is the work of Peter Beasecker. He currently teaches at Syracuse University up in upstate New York, and he kind of is a functional potter, kind of minimalist, and quite a craftsman. And I invited Peter primarily because I've known him the longest, since 1977 when we were in schools together at different, I was working on a master's degree and he was working on an undergraduate degree, not in ceramics. Peter's work is highly revered because of the craftsmanship and his inspiration on these pieces called carriers. His inspiration comes from several sources. In some cases, this is Richard Serra, the sculptor. Some of other inspiration for Peter's work is kind of shaker boxes and these carriers, hat boxes and things. And each one of these has these little cups that fit perfectly within this carrier, these carriers. And he also works kind of conceptually and sculpturally, like in this piece here. This tablet from a string series tablet made out of porcelain and a composition made in cobalt, dipped in strings dipped in cobalt. So that's one artist I invited. I should say that the whole theme of this exhibition, I was kind of strategic in choosing a variety of 8 artists that work differently in different genres. And I did that primarily because this is a college, and it gives students an opportunity to see a wide variety of technique and concept, not just all pots. So with that said, I'll move to Kensuke Yamada. Kensuke teaches at Center College in Kentucky, and I chose him because I find I guess some of my inspiration and admiration are his ability to technically build these, and he builds them with coils. But more so, I admire him because he's only been, he came to Japan to study ceramics, and he could not speak the language, so he uses clay as his vehicle for communication. I find these a little bit humorous, but also there's some sensibilities of sadness and the way he communicates, and this was without his use of the English language. It was his way of using clay as a vehicle for communication. But I also just love the looseness of them versus Peter Beasecker's very controlled tightness, and so I admire someone's ability to work very loose. And I think his inspiration also may come from some historical aspects of Japanese sculpture called Haniwa. This is my interpretation. So that's kind of another personal reason I chose him. And another artist that I invited is Shoko Teruyama. She's a full-time studio potter. She calls herself a potter, living in upstate New York, near Alfred University. And I'm just in awe and admiration of her ability to technically design beautiful functional work. And I guess you could call her almost a drawing illustration, the way she carves into the clay and uses such delicate, intricate patterns and designs, not only from floral and nature, but she also is a great draftsman and a storyteller, and some of her pots have narrative figures telling stories about her own experiences in life, and she is Japanese, and so some of her stories are from her own childhood, and in some cases, narrative. This is Giselle Hicks. Giselle lives in Colorado, and I chose her because she uses kind of minimalist forms, very beautiful, sculptural, maybe somewhat architectural, but what I love is that from a technical perspective, she works with coils of clay and then pinches the coils to create these beautiful forms. I just love the way she approaches clay, so I admire that. And she works pretty quick. She can work on several of these pieces just through rolling out coils and pinching and creating these great forms. So I chose her as she's my pinch pot person of the show. And I was hoping that students who do work in hand building would admire the work of Giselle's and maybe learn from her and her forms. So those are the artists that I selected. And since we're in here, I'll talk about the people who those artists selected. So we'll start right here. So Peter Beasecker really admires Mark Ferris, and I think if you look at if you study the work of both Peter and Mark Ferris, you'll see some reasons why. Mark works with slabs, and he works somewhat architectural, but he also works with geometry, and I guess you could say, as Peter described, a kind of a modernist approach in his form and in his decoration. And Mark is teaching at the University of Minnesota, and he's probably one of our more established artists. He's been teaching, I think, since the 70s at the University of Minnesota. So he is one of our leaders in the field of pottery and education. Giselle, the pinch pot potter, chose Rebecca. Rebecca Chappell is, I would say, one of the youngest artists in this exhibition from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She works with low fire clay, very colorful and very spirited. Giselle uses the word spirited, but she does make pots for table, for presentation of food, for candles, for dinnerware, and I guess you would say setting the table for a beautiful meal and celebration of food on that table. So hand-built, some of it's wheel-thrown and hand-built, and totally use of color and fun and spirit in her work. So another good, I think a good example for students who may want to work in low fire. This is low fire, whereas some of the other pieces were very high fire in temperature. So. And then right next to Shoko chose her husband and life partner, Matt Kelleher. Matt teaches at Alfred University in New York, and she chose him because, as in her own words, she thinks that he inspires her because he's always pushing the envelope in creating subtle changes in his own work. Sometimes you can't tell it, she says, but he's always in search of the next form. So these are wheel thrown, and then they're altered, and this is hand built and wheel thrown. And we were talking in a demonstration that I did yesterday, the use of darting. Darting is a technique where you cut away clay in order to change and alter the form and give it gesture, and you can really see it, especially in this piece here, the animation in these pictures. Kensuke chose Beth Lowe. Beth Lowe teaches at the University of Montana, and she was Kensuke's major professor at the university when he was in grad school. And Beth is Chinese American, and her work uses some humor and some iconography of Chinese, even some language. She and her sister write books. There's children's books. And so she works both functionally and sculpturally and uses porcelain. And these sculptural pieces here, I think, are stellar pieces of reflective of Beth's work. I just thought it was interesting that Kensuke chose Beth because of her mentorship with him in grad school. So that kind of wraps up this section of the gallery. We can move on to the other end and we'll talk more about the other 4 artists and their choices. Another artist that I invited was Sam Chung. Sam works in porcelain. He teaches at Arizona State University, and I think why I chose Sam is because I've known him. I knew him as an early artist when he was in grad school through Errolmont, through his association with Errolmont, and so he was an assistant at Errolmont at a young age, probably around 22, and now he's an associate professor at Arizona State University. But so that's kind of part of my theme of inspiration and admiration. Not only does he make beautiful work, but since we're talking about his work, and this is educational, he's been using the motif of clouds, and the cloud shape has been used in Asian art for many years, and so Sam's kind of taking it and using it more through some of these classic, you would call Chinese or Korean forms that he's borrowed, being Korean American. So, and he's such a master of throwing and altering. So technically, he throws these forms and then cuts these shapes out and then adds clay to create a dimensional aspect of these clouds coming out. And he's really, in the last maybe 3 years, started to do China painting, which is coming back. China painting was obviously used historically, and Sam's kind of taking a historical approach, not only to the motif of the clouds, but also bringing back China painting within a contemporary context of these great forms here. So another artist that I invited is Thaddeus Erdahl, lives in St. Petersburg, Florida, and we call him TJ, so I'll refer to him as TJ. And TJ was a resident artist at Errolmont, maybe 5 years ago. And we, after he was a resident artist at Errolmont, we hired him as program and studio manager. So I worked with him as a young, not real young, but as an emerging artist. And then I worked with him collegially at Errolmont as a staff member. And then now, his work, he's been really recognized as a new upcoming figurative sculptor. He's had great success with exhibitions in New York City, and he was also recently, a year ago, selected by the American Craft Council as one of the Young Emerging Voices Awards. So TJ, obviously a lot of his figures are politically narrative about his experience in the service in the Army. He went to the Army at a young age of 17, and so he does kind of do some storytelling about his experiences. But besides the narrative quality, I think he really, from a technique standpoint, works with great texture, use of a lot of different, I would say, unconventional way of using glazes and slips to create these wonderful textures, the textures that kind of tell stories on their own. So yeah, it's a little bit about TJ. And the other thing is he's now teaching middle school at a private school in St. Petersburg. So I admire that too, that somebody who's so talented as an artist can also have a career as an educator with the younger generation. And I'm sure he's inspiring 100 kids a week in the middle school, and I'm sure he's having a lot of fun with that too. So another artist we're going to move over is a potter named Jennifer Allen, and Jennifer Allen teaches adjunct at West Virginia University. And I just love her pots, and I think last night at the opening, other people loved her pots too. They're just compositionally, the forms just are energetic, and her amazing command of surface decoration by slip trailing and sgraffito and gestural. She really can move clay and alter it. So she's one of my favorite potters, and I have several pieces of her work at my home that I use. The eighth artist that I invited, whose work inspires me or who I admire, and I want to clarify that, Andrea Moon was also a resident artist at Errolmont about 5 years ago. And as I said last night in my gallery talk, of course I love her work because it's, she works with one element, shape, and out of that she tries to create, she says she's trying to create order out of chaos. And so using this repetitive shape sculpturally, creating these great forms. But what I admire about Andrea is she gave up a full-time tenure-track teaching job in order to come to Errolmont to be an artist. And I thought that was a leap of faith that I always admired, since so many people her age are in search of a tenure-track teaching job. So she kind of left it to be an artist. And I think for her, it paid off, and she just wanted to spend a year being a full-time artist, so it elevated her work. So I'm going to talk about this artist and who they selected. So right from Andrea chose Dryden Wells, and we'll move to his work here. And Dryden works as a potter, and he has lived in China for 7 years prior to moving to the United States, and now he's back in China with Andrea, his wife. His teapots and his tea caddies all are about the tea culture of China, so he's really working with the function of pots that supplement the tea drinking culture of China. So these are beautiful little teapots, and some people were looking at them and looking at the delicate way he creates these surface designs and textures. And very tiny. Most teapots in China only hold 1 or 2 cups, so totally different than our culture of a big 10-cup teapot. So with that, I'm going to move to T.J. Erdahl's selection. T.J. chose Russell Wrankle. Russell teaches at Southern Utah University, and his work is kind of hyper-realism, sculptural, using clay, almost what they call trompe-l'oeil. People can't believe this is clay. This looks like it's been stretched over fabric or dipped in something, but it's all clay, and very narrative, very metaphorical. I think students here at Parkland would benefit by doing some research on Russell's work and his artist statement, and going to his website to find out how he not only technically achieves this, but the stories behind these pieces here. These pieces are the work of Andy Brayman, and Andy Brayman was selected by Sam Chung. So if you remember, Sam Chung uses China paints in his cloud motifs. I asked Sam why he chose Andy, and it was pretty obvious. He said that about 4 years ago, 6 artists did this exchange of each other's work, and they trusted one another, so they would ship one another's work and that to an artist, and then the artist would do something of their technical savviness on their friend's pot. And Andy is a real, I would say Andy's work is probably the most, of all the work in here, is using technology, 3D printing. He's a master of decals and also slip casting. So I thought this was a great body of work for the students to see. But back to why Sam chose Andy is because when Andy took Sam's work 5 years ago, he used decals of his own making and put them on Sam's work, and it gave Sam a new idea of graphic design on his pots. So thus Sam started doing the China painting. So Sam credits Andy for enlightening him on China, to move into China painting. So that's their connection with why they inspired one another. And last but not least, we'll go to Jennifer Allen's. Jennifer Allen chose Steve Godfrey. And Steve Godfrey teaches at the University of Alaska in Anchorage, and he was Jennifer's professor in undergraduate school. And she talks about how he designs individual pieces almost sculpturally for the table. Like this is a salt cellar for salt with the spoon. And so she was intrigued as a young undergraduate how he would design works for the table and engineer them as well. He also uses the dodo bird and this magpie. He lives in Alaska and he really celebrates the wildlife of his surroundings and uses them in his functional work. Also, Jennifer said that he's a great cook and he would actually use a lot of pottery in setting the table. And she thought that as a young 20-year-old, she just found that inspiring, and she admired him in that respect as well. So that kind of concludes this part of the gallery here. So in kind of closing comments here, I wanted to say two things. I'm really thankful that Lisa chose me as the curator for this biennial. I've kind of followed the ceramic biennials for the last 15 or 20 years, working at Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts, where I am administrator, but also a working ceramic artist. So just a little bit of how I got to know all these people in this exhibition. Out of the 16 artists, 14 of them have taught at Arrowmont, and I have hired them to teach workshops. So that wasn't planned. The eight that I chose were planned, but I feel fortunate that where I work, I've been exposed to a lot of different genres of art, and clay especially is my field. And because of that, it was easy to pick. It was hard to pick, but it was easy to pick because I wanted this to be an educational exhibition because it's at a college. So consequently, I did choose people who work in different genres of clay. But I want to say, when you curate a show, it's all on paper for a long, long, long time. And there's a lot of communication with the artist. And then, lo and behold, all the artwork arrives in crates and boxes, and then Lisa and her staff have to unpack. And so what really made it exceptional for me when I came in town 2 nights ago is when we opened the gallery door that evening and I walked in, it felt so warm and inviting and comforting because I know all these artists and I know their work, but I had never seen it all together. So I said to Lisa, it's kind of like coming into someone's home for a dinner party and all the guests you're friends with, and it was kind of comforting. And so that was my emotional reaction to seeing all the work together.